if we find ourselves alienated from nature, part of the reason for that, or maybe the big part, is the patriarchal structure that we live under. I think that alienation is a greater problem for men, and it has everything to do with our alienation from our own bodies as part of the natural world. So that's challenging to address. I'm trying to just say, what do I have to lose? This is what I should be doing.
I want to thank you so much, Scott, for making time to speak with me today. I appreciate it very much.
Glad to do it. I'm honored that you asked.
I've seen quite a bit of your work now on Instagram and on your website, and so I'm really interested to hear a lot more about what inspires you to do that work. But I'll start just by asking you, what led you to photography?
I had worked for a long time doing science writing, actually. I was in graduate school, I was in ecology, and then I got into science writing, mostly environment and nature-related stuff, and did that for a number of years and got kind of burnt out on it. And just at one point, this was probably 10 or 12 years ago, I just sort of came to this conclusion that I wanted to try making art in some form. It's sort of a radical change of direction for me. But having decided that, photography seemed like the logical thing to pick up because I had some experience with it. I felt like I could grasp photography. I think every photographer will say, well, I was never any good at drawing. But that's true for me, certainly. So it took me quite a while to get better at it. I mean, I started taking some community college classes to improve technical skills and learning about it on my own, doing some workshops and internships and just trying to learn more about the contemporary photography world. That's been going on for the past decade or so.
Already that bit of insight around your past life as a science and nature writer is so interesting because nature is a huge character in your work. And so that is just very interesting to hear where maybe that has come from.
Yeah, exactly. That's certainly the thread of continuity between these different endeavors. I was in graduate school twice. I studied cultural anthropology at first, and then was out for a while, and then went back and studied ecology. So all that's in the background, and to some extent in the photography.
Very much, very much. So maybe we can talk about some of the projects that you have worked on or are working on, and I'll let you choose. What's one project that you'd like to start with?
I think we're going to talk a little more about the self-portraiture. So maybe I'll start by talking about something else, which is a project I've done along the American River where I live in Sacramento. And, it's a series of black and white images of mostly trees, some water. This project started during the COVID lockdowns when just getting out to the river was an escape. It was a refuge that I could go to. And, I had always, or for a long time, gone walking at the river, running, and had never really thought of photographing it before. But once I started to do that, I realized I just saw it more clearly. I saw more and in greater depth than I had before. And I felt like this familiar place was sort of becoming alive to me in a way that I hadn't quite experienced it before. I mean, it was always alive in a sense, but I hadn't perceived it. And and so I would go out walking and taking pictures, and then I'd come home and I would think about the river a lot when I wasn't there. And in some ways, I think I understood more or different things about it then when I was sort of thinking about my walks and what I had seen. And I don't know, I started to really have this sense of the river as a body, a single body, sort of like my body, but vast because it's extended in space widely from the Sierras to the Pacific and deep back in time too. This river has always been flowing through the Central Valley ever since the Sierras first rose up. So there was sort of a bodiness to it and a vastness to it that I felt really connected to. And it was, I don't know, it was sort of a transformative thing for me spending time out there. And also thinking about it, it's not a particularly wild place. I mean, I'm working in portions of the American River Parkway that have some protection, but they're heavily used by people. But it still is a habitat for a lot of birds and animals. And, it's their refuge too. And I see lots of species out there at the river that I don't see anywhere else, in my suburban neighborhood. I started thinking about just the experience of the river's remaining wildness, as opposed to whether or not it is a wild place. And it was very meaningful to think about it that way, I think. This experience of aliveness of the river that I've been describing was part of that. And I'm saying all this because I think it does relate to some of the other work I've done, some of the self-portraiture. I wasn't photographing myself at the river, but I think the same sensibility was present in how I was approaching it. So anyway, that's my current project that I've been working the most on. I've been getting that project organized and in making a photo book with that, which will be my first photo book.
There's something interesting about the idea of water too. I find that fascinating in a way because you were saying before about how it can become depressing if you're studying nature and the environment and the degradation of the environment and the wildness or the loss of wildness and the habitats. And so there's teeming life or less teeming life on the shores of the river and the animals and the birds that tend to go there. And the water can be more or less degraded. But I'm fascinated by the fact that the water, there's never going to be more water and there's never going to be less water. You can't destroy it. You can't create it. There's just one set of water that exists in the world and it's never going. And there's something actually kind of exhilarating about that. We may put lots of things into the water that make it unusable for us and for other living creatures, but the water itself is eternal.
Yeah.
It's not going anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I know. I was thinking quite a bit about exactly that. And I also started doing a lot of writing about the river and my experience there. And I thought I might try to do a book with writing and photographs both. And now I think it's turning into just a photo book, but the writing, which addresses some of the things that you were just saying, may come out as a separate thing.
I find it interesting you have a background as more of a science writer, because when I read your statements, and one of the things I love about your website is every project has a statement. Now, you don't just have an artist statement, like every project has a statement. And you write in a very poetic, beautiful way, which now that I know that you wrote science, I mean, I don't know if you were writing science in a poetic way, you might have been.
Well, I felt like I had a little leeway to write in a very poetic way. But I've always written poetry too. So,
well, that's that. See, all of these things that come out of the conversation that lend so much more not understanding, but just more breadth when you look at your work, which is fascinating. I love that. Very cool. Okay, so if you had to just articulate the theme of the river project, because after I just want to say, like, so that's the sort of the main theme you think you're exploring through the river project, and how does that relate to some of the other projects you've worked on? What would you say would be, if you had to kind of narrow it to one or two poetic? No pressure, no pressure.
Well, I think it's just, the overlap between the body and the environment, or the personal self and the environment. And some of that just comes through this sort of strange and, to me, kind of amazing thing that the camera allows, as sort of a tool for seeing and thinking about the world. And that's sort of what was going on for me out there. The camera itself has such a similarity to our own bodies. I mean, we compare ourselves to computers sometimes. I think we're much more similar to a camera, right? I mean, the camera has a body, and it has a lens for seeing that's looking outward, from the body onto the world. And it carries memories inside of it. And you can take that tool and you can go out searching for things. And I've always loved just the idea of searching. I loved Easter egg hunts when I was a kid, right? Just go find something cool, or or a scavenger hunt. And with the camera, you're out there just trying to find some sort of meaningful form or relation in the physicality of the world. It's something that's sort of hidden in plain sight, I guess, and maybe invisible until you can give it visibility in a photograph. So, the River Project, I think this would apply to all my projects, is sort of working at what I consider the intersection of place and personality. I don't know. There's a new photo book, a new book of writing about photography, by Tim Carpenter, who talks about photography as exploring the gap between the self and the not self, and attempting to find some reconciliation there, and maybe a momentary bridge or merger of the public world and your private perception. And that description really just rang true for me. And with respect to the work I was doing, there's a sense of connection with the world that comes through working with the camera that I just find very sort of motivating and fulfilling, and regardless of any outcome of that in terms of, making art or whatever.
I think there was something I want to say, but I feel like it's not appropriate until we move on to maybe to dualities. But you just sparked something around that distinction that we also draw between ourselves and the environment, that, and between ourselves and other living creatures. Somehow we're human and those are animals. Yeah. And that's one of the things that drives me nuts. I'm like, no, we're animals. We're all animals. There's animals, plants, there's minerals. And there's something about your photographs, I feel, that really evoke that, like, break that down. We're not separate. Not only are we not separate from animals, we're not separate from any of it. And you put yourself, or you put people directly into the environment in a way that they just blend and are one. Like, sounds so corny, but like, they are one with the environment. They're just a part of it. They don't stand outside of it. They don't control it.
I mean, I really appreciate that, Sarah. That's a great compliment to me, because I feel like that's exactly what I'm hoping can come across in the work. So
that was that stood out to me, I think. So if we could move like that, so I think you've like, we've talked about river, and I think there's some general themes that emerge. And the work on your river project, I guess, kind of came from or germinated from some of your early projects, like Dualities, for example, is one that I'm also super interested to hear you talk about.
So, well, the Dualities project began, pretty early on after my momentous decision to, damn it, I'm going to become an artist. And
you're inspiring me with that, by the way. I love that. I think that's fantastic. It gives hope to the rest of us that we can just say, damn it, I'm going to be an
absolutely.
artist.
Yes, you can. Right. Yeah. And this was also a time, it was just a couple of years after my father had died. And he lived, my mom had passed away quite a bit earlier, and he had lived alone in this house that they had built together out near the boundary of the Point Reyes National Seashore, north of San Francisco, which is a place that we went a lot when I was a kid too. And so throughout my life, I was going to this place and to those beaches and hiking these trails. And so that was the landscape I associated with him. And I was sort of struck in a strange way after he died, just by the obvious fact that all these familiar places were still there, even though he was not, except for maybe all the ways in which he was. but but this also led me to think more about, the experience of my father's death. Of course, made me think more about my own mortality, and how someday I'll be the one missing from the picture. I just started making these pairs of photographs put together as diptychs of some of the places that I had associated with him. And there's two photographs just taken usually a few moments apart, but in one of them, I'm present in the image, and in the other, I'm not, and otherwise nearly identical landscapes. And somehow from the start, I felt very strongly that, to say something about bodily presence on the earth and mortality, that I should be naked in these pictures. So that's what I did, which was very strange for me at first, and not really like anything I had ever considered doing before. But in any case, I started making these pairs of images and looking at them, and I don't know, they seemed really interesting to me, and in some ways that I hadn't really thought of at first. You can look at a diptych almost as a single image, or as two separate images side by side. And as a single image, you can sort of take it in. The gestalt is of a larger landscape with some maybe horizon line running through it. And as a pair of images, they always sort of raise the question of what is really different between the one on the left and the one on the right. The difference is really that just a little time has passed, which it could be a moment. It could be the difference between life and death, I suppose. And then in addition to the presence or absence of my own body, there were other subtle differences that you could start to notice, because some time had passed. And so the clouds were in a slightly different position in the sky, or the leaves or the grass would be blown into a slightly different position, and things like that.
This again is probably like way oversimplified, but when you talk about the images as the diptych, and sometimes the horizon's sort of straight across, or sometimes it's more angled, and it's not always the case, but sometimes they look like mirrors of each other. And there are slight differences. So in my head, I just went to this place of like, so Scott's in this one and his father's in this one, but we can't see his father because he's passed. But right. They're kind of mirror images of each other, except like you said, which I wouldn't have noticed, but there's also these other small different. So you're not the same man as your father, but there's this like father-son mirror. I don't know. I just went off on a tangent with that. But
No. That's not a tangent. That's exactly it, I think. But the mirroring effect came about when, I decided to just try flipping one of the images around horizontally, and so then the two sides really do mirror each other, and there's a symmetry. There's an axis of symmetry running down the the center, or the little white line that divides the two images. So I started trying to, I would do this on some, but not others. And I thought this was another thing I thought was interesting, was that when you did that mirroring, then the landscape took on this symmetry that kind of echoed the symmetry of the human body. So there's the small human body and the larger landscape body, I guess, one nested in the other. So yeah, so that's it. And yeah, the presence to absence of my father, and the one where I'm not there, was definitely what I was also trying to suggest. And just the continuity again between ourselves and the landscape, and that maybe all that slight difference is all that our presence or absence really amounts to also. And some of this relates to what I can understand of the Buddhist concept of non-duality, which is where the project title comes from, and also the ecological understanding of how we just have no hard boundaries and are in constant flux with the environment. So yeah, I started doing that. Oh, another thing I thought was cool was just how, in the ones where the landscape is flipped and mirrored, then if you make this comparison of right and left, the thing that's different is where the symmetry is not perfect, right? Something is different on one side or the other, which just seemed like a sort of different way of visualizing the passage of time, between two still photographs.
And actually the body too, right? Because we're not perfectly symmetrical. We've got
Well,
our
exactly.
liver on one side and the diaphragm slightly different. And they're not perfectly symmetrical, our bodies either.
Yeah. So, and then at some point I decided I kind of needed to, I got some good initial feedback and decided that I needed to broaden the scope of it a bit beyond just these presence, absence of the body images. So, I experimented with different kinds of pairings that I think were all, or mostly all, related to sort of different dualisms, human and animal, male and female, or just two moments in the landscape with no human presence at all. So yeah, that was the project. I mean, it went on for a while. I think I still like that project. I think it was successful and kind of came to a conclusion, unlike unlike a lot of my work, which seems to just sort of go on and on.
They're still evolving. They're evolving. That's perfect. There was one aspect of that concept of duality I found really interesting in your statements. So when I read the statement, I guess, about the Dualities Project, I think it was that one, where this idea that there's a difference between the male presence in the environment versus the female presence. And you're sort of trying to tip that male gaze onto a female body and flip it around. Like, I thought that was fascinating. Because that whole male gaze is such a big thing, and art, and looking at it more from the lost opportunities of men to be present as objects in the environment or part of the environment. I thought that was really cool.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. I mean, that actually, it's in the statement of the Mediations Project.
Okay.
I talk about that a little bit. I mean, I do a lot of different kinds of work, and I'm interested in the human body, so I've worked with different human subjects, male and female. When I was doing the Dualities Project, I felt like there was sort of a concept there, and I really wasn't trying to necessarily engage in a genre of, like, the photographic nude or nude self-portraiture or whatever. And but then if I'm photographing a woman, I find it harder to say that I'm not engaging with a genre, because I'm sort of very conscious of being part of this historical tradition of of male artists who are presumably clothed, making images of naked women. And then I'm also aware of course, of the feminist critique of this whole situation, which is encapsulated in the concept of the male gaze. So I don't know, for me, there's a tension or vulnerability I feel around that because I consider myself to be a feminist, but I also want to explore what it means to be a human being. And being a man is only half of that. So I don't know. I started to think of some of the self-portraiture I was doing as one thing that I can do as a man is to not always remain the sort of invisible figure behind the camera, but make myself visible, in front of the camera with my own body. I think there's some meaning to that gesture. And I think it's something more male photographers should consider doing, actually.
Oh, I actually loved that. I thought that was a thing. I think that's what captured me when I saw your photographs and I realized that they were of you. And I thought, how unbelievably like they're very sensitive. The shots are super sensitive of the body, and they're very sensitive portraits of the environment. And the harmony is so lovely. But the fact that you are putting yourself in front of your camera without clothes on I think that's huge. I think that's fascinating. I think that's really, really a brave thing to do. And also, kind of a political thing to do in art. Like, I think you're right. I think it would be great if more artists in general felt what it was like to be the subject of someone else's gaze in whatever situation. It's super intimidating. I've done a couple of things myself where I put myself in front to be seen. And afterwards I thought, Sarah, what have you done? Like, what have you done? And then I remember the drawing classes, figure drawing classes, and having nude models often, and how grateful that we all were to have people who were willing to put themselves literally on a pedestal in front of us so that we could learn how to draw the human body. Yeah. So we're also, people are so anxious in it. Well, no, I shouldn't say people. Some people are anxious and embarrassed about what it feels like to be seen or to be looked at. But you did it to yourself, which is pretty amazing. And then you had to look at those photos and presumably sort of edit them or choose what you wanted and pair them with different shots. And so you're looking at yourself quite a bit.
Yeah.
That's not an easy thing to do, Scott. I'm really impressed.
It's true. And God, I don't know. I think it's sort of therapeutic in a way. I would encourage people to do that, even if you're not going to ever show the pictures to anyone else. But I think in the case of men, I think it's even more complicated in a way. We have this cultural history. We have all these dichotomies, right, and associations, and we've sort of always associated the female more closely with nature and with the body, and the male with culture and rational mind, and that's sort of the basis of patriarchal thinking, right? But I've found being out there in my body in nature is this profound experience. And if men are denying themselves that, they're depriving themselves of something, right? And whether or not society is willing to sort of embrace the male nude in the way it does the female, why is that? That it seems like that's something that should be questioned.
I think that's fascinating. And the last thing I would just is say, just as far as the nude, taking photographs of nudes in nature, just to say that reminds me again of that idea of we're no different than the animals and the birds and the mammals, and they're not wearing clothes either. We're just out there in their own skins, doing without any self-consciousness of their bodies at all.
Yeah.
So you kind of modeled that for a human being, that as an animal, as a human animal.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's exactly what I'm trying to do. I think a lot of photographic work is done around the question of identity and people asserting, a different, a particular identity, people in different situations, right? And I think for me, maybe because of my, white male privilege, I have the luxury of thinking this way. I don't know. But for me, my question is less about who I am than what I am. And the what means, I'm a human being, but I'm also a man. I have this male body, which is going to experience the world presumably differently in ways than a female body would. But I'm also an animal, I'm also, which means I have a lot of things. There's a lot of commonalities and differences with other animals. And I'm, a point on an evolutionary trajectory that, goes way back in time and connects me with all the life on the planet. And I'm also just a thing. I'm just this solid lump of physical matter made up of atoms
Mostly
that,
water, actually,
that
though, right?
originated
Like
in,
2/3
in
water,
stars. Yeah, and mostly water. Yeah, sure.
which means we're part of that
So,
whole interconnectedness of water, the eternal mass of water in the world, in a way.
mm-hmm.
So we're sort of talking around this, but I guess I wanted to ask you a bit more explicitly. So, like you as Scott, in the kinds of work that you've done and that you shared, what do you think it is about you that you reveal about yourself through the work that you do?
Mm. I don't know. I mean, I think I just reveal myself as somebody who is feels very very much a part of and not apart from this living world um and the being willing to uh, stand in front of the camera or just the experience of doing that it really sort of I think heightens that sense of connection. And and then in my other work, I mean, I'm hopefully also revealing something about myself as an artist, maybe, and the things I see, the things I notice.
For example, having seen some of your work and speaking with you now, I think you reveal a really strong intellectual, but like grounded in the world, but intellectual curiosity. That you're the camera, and you've got your lens out, and you're looking at the world, and you're making the memories, but then you're also trying to see, well, what is that? What is that about? What are the connections? Like, what am I showing about the relationships of the different things that exist in the environment, including myself? How am I connected to all of the things that are around me?
I probably over intellectualize things
Sometimes
more
an
than I
occupational
should.
hazard.
But I mean, when I got into my work down in the desert, which came sort of after the dualities, I was reading a lot of philosophy. I was reading eco philosophy and feminist philosophy, and a whole bunch of things that had to do with my interest in body and perception. And I got really into the French phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who had just a ton of fascinating things to say about that. The question is, to what extent some of that is able to translate into pictures, right? I mean, it's great to be motivated by ideas like this, and it's great to be out there and having these kinds of experiences that are very meaningful. But particularly in the desert work, I just feel like that's where the meaning is in the experiences that I've had there. And I've just been very unsure about what really comes out of that. It's hard enough to make a really good photograph when you're looking through the camera, but when you're not even looking through the camera, I don't know. A lot of the photographs are I think maybe not that good, but then people tell me that they find them interesting, and you have responded to them. So uh, I don't know. I'm still trying to work it out. Like how to make how to make some of this work that's both intellectually engaging and aesthetically good, and putting images into sequence, and in the form of a photo book is adds another dimension to that, right? And it can be part of the solution, but can also be a new challenge, which is what I'm currently working on with the river project.
What's your response when you share your work or you put your work out on Instagram or you show it to, I don't know, your friends or colleagues or other photographers? What kind of range of responses do you get? Do people tend to respond in a unified kind of way to your work, or do you get a broad range of interpretation? Somebody will say, "Oh, I see this," and somebody will say, "Oh, but I see that." Somebody else, I don't know. How do people respond to your work, and how do you feel about that?
Well, I think quite a broad range, actually. I mean, Instagram, I can share some of the images, but not others, or I can censor them. I mean, it's not ideal. But I guess through that, I have had, I've had people reach out to me. I've had a number of people, a number of other artists, and mostly artists that are not necessarily photographers, but people doing different things have have reached out and said things similar to what you said, that they I don't know, they seemed to get it, and they felt it was meaningful, and it was cool that I was doing this kind of work. And I've heard that from women, which always makes me feel like, okay, that's what I had hoped maybe would happen.
I'm going to take advantage of your intellectual, curious mind, though. And I'm going to ask you what vulnerability means to you as an idea, as a concept. What does vulnerability mean to you?
Oh, I think it just means all of the ways in which human beings are fragile creatures and live in a fragile world. And so I was talking about how I felt this connection with the river, when I from working out there. And that's almost the deepest vulnerability is when you love a place, or when you love anything. The nature of anything we love is that it's not always going to be there. It's going to change, or it's going to go away in some way. And so that's one fairly deep level of it. I did these photographs, and I have reasons for doing them, but I'm always aware that a lot of people would consider it really weird and maybe inappropriate to be doing some of this work. So, of course, there's vulnerability there in just being out, making the work itself, and then in sharing the work, certainly. And sometimes I wonder what the hell I'm doing, but then I have to get back. I have to regain the perspective from which I know what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and it does make sense. But it's easy to fall out of that, and sort of adopt the you imagine as a conventional mindset.
Well, I'm going to add my support to you. So when you have a moment of doubt, I'm going to be in your mind saying, don't stop, Scott. Recenter and keep going.
Right on. Yeah. I mean, that's great. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Cool. Thank you so much, Scott. That was wonderful.
All right. Thanks
Take
again.
care. Bye.